Canadians are overpaying for a lot of stuff. I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. The National Post put out an article talking about all the ways Canadians are getting ripped off. Now, there really are two fundamental reasons for this. Number one is a lack of business competition within Canada, which is enabled ultimately by a government who is content with oligopolies running the show. It's not even like it's a matter of the government not doing anything, but instead them creating an environment where this type of behavior is thriving. Just for reference, an oligopoly is a market condition where things are dominated by a small number of suppliers, and I'm sure a lot of industries are coming to your mind already. In Canada, this usually means a low level of competitiveness and, well, to some obvious degree, price fixing. Now, if it's not the competition, that's the problem. We kind of touched on this already, but the other most likely reason for issues with pricing is simply government interference or incompetence. Now, we'll come back to this in a little bit. I just want to start off by listing some examples now. The first one in the article is cell phone charges. They say that in most of Europe, it can cost as little as $30 for a monthly cell phone plan with 100 gigabytes of mobile data. And they found that in Canada, that kind of plan would be $144. Quite a difference there. Now, why is that? Well, in Canada, 3 companies run the show: TELUS, Rogers, and Bell. In fact, they control more than 90% of the Canadian wireless market. And federal regulations, here's where the government comes in, makes it very difficult for cheaper foreign competitors to enter the market. So you're stuck with them. Whenever competition does arise, like with Freedom Mobile, who used to be Win Mobile, for example, one of the big 3 just acquires them. Or if it's not the big 3, it's another big competitor like Shaw. And then they neutralize the competitive threat. Given these variables, there is no reason or motivation for these companies to provide better services at better rates because Canadians have no other options. They control 90% of the market. Where are you going to go? Now, the next example is air travel. In 2016, the flight website Kiwi.com ranked countries by the average cost of flying 100 km. Now, in Canada, look at Air Canada or WestJet. That 100 km journey would cost about $123. In America, meanwhile, it would only be $23. So a $100 difference there. And at the time of the study, this made Canada the 6th most expensive country in the world to buy an airline ticket for. This situation is akin to the previous one with wireless providers. More than 90% of domestic air travel is done with either WestJet or Air Canada. So no competition. And once again, on the government side of things, federal law is quite vigilant about keeping foreign competitors out. There's a trend there. Now, the next example might surprise you. The article talks about healthcare, and they say that the US-based Commonwealth Fund consistently ranks Canada as being second only to America in terms of healthcare spending as ranked against performance. So, another way to say that is we pay more for healthcare than anyone else except for America, and we get the least in return. So, in Canada, we pay a lot, but we still have things like family doctor shortages and overrun hospitals, and wait times that are bordering excessive. Countries like Belgium, France, Germany, Japan, they all spend way less on universal healthcare and outrank Canada on essentially every metric, according to the article. And that's from things like performance to wait times to capita hospital beds. Then you have something like gas. Canada tops the leaderboard when it comes to the West, not including Europe. There isn't a single other country in the Americas that is fueling their cars with $2.30 per liter petrol. That's the current rate in Vancouver. Then you have milk. Canadian dairy comes at a significant premium as compared to American milk and cheese. And the article writes that Argentina turned out to be the world's 2nd most expensive country for milk, only behind Canada. And why is this? This is more so on the government side of things. They write that since the 1970s, Canada's dairy sector has been under the top-down control of a state-sanctioned cartel that explicitly works to artificially raise prices by limiting supply. Now, the global oil market actually runs that exact same way. The government supports this board of milk traders, and they can play with the supply as much as they want. And they're going to do that to their benefit and to the detriment of you, the consumer. Why that's allowed? Well, the milk industry has a lot of lobbyists, and the politicians are in their pocket. Now, that's quite unfortunate, especially when there are easy solutions here, such as taking down the government bureaucracy, or simply increasing competition that can come quite simply through foreign competitors. Then, of course, you have housing. UBS ranked Toronto as the world's bubbliest housing market, with Vancouver in 6th place. Why is all this happening? Canada has a housing shortage, of course. On top of that, extraordinarily high prices, which come from the shortage. If houses were a normal commodity, the article writes, the market would simply build new ones until the prices were stabilized. But in Canada, they can't do that. There's a ton of red tape from the government, making it harder and more expensive to do so, such as zoning bylaws, for example. Now, the basic fact of the matter here is that it's expensive to live in Canada. But don't get me wrong, I still think that Canada is one of the best, if not the best, country in the world to reside in. Every place has its downsides, and we're quite lucky to have one that is rather benign overall. We're not living under a dictatorship, under military rule. We're not living under conditions of 100% plus inflation, as with Turkey. But we do pay a bit more for things that we can obviously get for cheaper. And they're propped up by insane market conditions that the government largely has a role to play in. There are really two things that we have to crack down on. The first is oligopolies and even monopolies in some cases. We cannot afford to have such constrained competitive conditions. The market has to be free to thrive. The market has to be free to respond to the demands of the consumer. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with those outrageous cell phone plans while other countries like Europe get amazing deals. When you have a big three in telecom that controls 90% of the market, and we all know, underneath the table, they are subtly colluding. They're not undercutting each other price-wise. They're setting benchmarks and none of them are daring to go below it. Because why would they? At the end of the day, if they can get consumers onto a $50 plan and they're splitting that market share, there's no reason for them to go down to 20. They'll just hurt themselves. We need a third party to come in here and shake things up, who are willing to provide that lower fee to get some market share. As we've talked about, the Canadian government has set up conditions where it's extremely hard for competition to enter, whether that's domestic or foreign. And here is the underlying pattern. The Canadian government wants a lot of control in the markets, but on the other hand, they're largely incompetent, and that control is not helping the Canadian citizenry. It's only helping the industry giants. Maybe that's not what they wanted, but it is what's happening. The government simply has not proved itself capable of using that power for the betterment of society. It's actually the opposite. Market forces would be far better of a regulating force if left to their own devices largely. Of course, we do need government regulation in terms of setting a benchmark bar. But when it comes to curbing competition, that's a bad idea. And the government usually says, well, we want Canadian companies to succeed. And that's fine. That's a point that they can make. But if your concern is with foreign competition, keep your concern to foreign competition. The Canadian government has curbed competition across the board. If you want Canadian companies to succeed, well, let's fund Canadian competition. Let's provide funds to grassroots companies and make it easy for them to get going. And let's make it hard for big companies to buy them out. That's the way we should be going. But the government has not done that at all. They are overly aggressive when it comes to maintaining the status quo, and they're basically sleeping when it comes to shaking things up even with domestic Canadian production. They're going to say they're doing this for the sake of keeping Canadian companies strong, but at the end of the day, they're only doing this to keep those who likely are lobbyists and funding their campaign strong, such as the Big Three. I guarantee they have a lot of funds going towards the government. And the government is aware of that. And they're doing things to keep them happy, essentially. And my second point was essentially wrapped up in there. The next thing that we have to curb is government interventionism domestically. It's good when it works, but currently it is not working. Things are getting more expensive. There are less options for consumers, all at the hands of a government system that has failed the average Canadian citizen. The government has to stick to what it's good at and what is necessary, and they have to let the markets do what they're good at. The government has to set those benchmarks that we talked about, such as setting up environmental protections, setting up laws for labor, ensuring that people are not being taken advantage of. But when it comes down to curbing competition, they've stepped out of their lane. They're trying to do too much. The markets would handle that just fine. I predict that in these times of insane inflation, these pressures will begin to mount with the government. The average citizen is not going to be happy when they understand the current market setup and the role the government has played in enacting that. Things are likely arranged for change to happen in the short term, but we will see. Now with that, it does bring us to the end of our conversation for today. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. They'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perryplatform.org and on social media at perryplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.